Today is October 4th, 2023. We are interviewing Renee Rosenthal. My name is Esther Finder. Mr. Rosenthal is in Baltimore, Maryland. I am in Henderson, Nevada, in the United States, and the language will be English. Thank you for speaking with us today. What is your name, sir, and can you please spell it?
My name is Renee Rosenthal, Renerosenthal.
Was that your name at birth?
Yes, it was.
Where were you born?
I was born in Stockholm, Sweden.
And when were you born?
I was born on August 27th, 1931.
And how old are you today, sir?
I am 92 years old.
How long did you live in Stockholm?
I was only there for a few months.
And why did you leave so quickly?
We lived in Antwerp, Belgium during those days, and my parents thought that medical care was better in Sweden, and that's why I was born there.
What was your father's name?
My father's name was Sigismund Rosenthal.
Where was he born?
My father was born in Estonia.
When did he leave Estonia and why?
I really can't answer that question. I don't know.
What was his occupation?
My father was a textile manufacturer.
What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Selma Khan.
Could you spell her last name?
Cahn.
Where was she born?
My mother was born in Riga, Latvia.
When did she leave and why?
Same thing, I don't know.
What work did she do?
My mother was a housewife.
What do you know about relationships between the Jews and their neighbors in Amsterdam before the war?
I know nothing about Amsterdam before the war.
Okay. What religious traditions did your family observe?
My parents were Orthodox Jewish.
Do you remember anything from your childhood, any religious observances?
Well, I do remember my father taking me to synagogue on Shabbat. I also remember going to Seder services during Passover.
Were you an only child or did you have siblings?
I had a brother.
Older or younger?
My brother was 2 years older.
And his name?
My brother's name was Henry.
What are some of your earliest memories?
Oh, my earliest memories were living in Antwerp and going to school there and going with my parents on Sundays to the park. That about sums it up about my really early memories.
Well, let me rephrase my question from before. I think I asked you about Amsterdam instead of Antwerp. I apologize. Can you tell me what the relationships were between Jews and Christians in your hometown?
I really can't answer that. I was only 8 or 9 years old. I had friends who were Jewish and I had friends who were Gentiles, but I really can't answer that question.
You have no memories of anti-Semitism in your childhood?
No, not in Belgium.
I know you were young, but how much do you think your parents knew about the Nazis before the war came to you? Were they alarmed by what was going on?
Oh, yes, my parents, as I learned later, were very much aware, mostly because I knew about the planning that they had made for us to try to leave Belgium.
What do you remember about those plans?
Well, I remember about what happened when we ended up both in Dunkirk and in Barcelona, Spain. All of that was due to my parents' planning.
Can you take me by the hand and walk me through first Dunkirk, and then we can go beyond that?
Yes.
But let's first.
Well, the war started in September of 1939. In the spring of 1940, Belgium was already involved in the war, although Belgium was not occupied by the Germans at that time. And my parents decided that it was time to leave. My father had a business in London, England, so the plans were made to go to England. And we traveled first to Boulogne and then to Calais, which was very close to Dunkirk. Then we arrived in Dunkirk, and unfortunately, we were caught in no man's land between a little over 250,000 British soldiers trying to get over to England, and the Germans are basically coming closer and attacking, and we were right in the middle. Eventually, the Germans caught up to us, and my parents did speak German, and they escorted us back into the German lines and then back to Antwerp, Belgium, where we stayed for another year. During that period, my father was arrested once, but he was able to bribe his way out of jail and then made plans for us to escape to go to Barcelona, Spain, which we did.
Okay, before you get to Spain, let me just get a little more information about what you just said. How did you travel when you were going to, you ended up in the area around Dunkirk? How did you travel there?
We traveled by train to Boulogne and then by bus, I think it was to Calais. And from there on, it was primarily on foot. Calais was fairly close to Dunkirk.
Was there a specific catalyst that made your parents leave at that time? Or was this just they were planning it?
My parents saw the writing on the wall about what the Germans were doing.
And when was this exactly that you ended up in the area around Dunkirk? Can you
It
give
was
me a time?
in June of 1940.
Did anybody travel with your family, or was it
No.
just you?
No, we were by ourselves.
What do you remember of that situation being between the British and the Germans? What memories do you have?
I remember basically we were all lying on the ground. As a matter of fact, my leg was grazed by a bullet. It was not a big deal, but it did require some care later on when we went back to the German lines. But all I remember was seeing a lot of fighting, a lot of planes shooting at each other, and chaos, basically.
So you had to go back home. And you mentioned your father had been arrested. Do you know why he was arrested?
I don't know for sure. All I can do is guess that he was Jewish.
What memories do you have of that year before you were able to get out again?
Okay, well, as a young boy, I was having a good time. after the air raids, we would go outside and try to pick up shrapnels, which was something that we all collected. So I don't remember too much negative because, as I said, I was only 8, 9 years old. I was having a good time. In those days, the war didn't really mean that much to me.
Did you have to wear a yellow star?
No, there was nothing. There was none of that during the time we were in Antwerp.
Did you witness any brutality at the hands of the Nazis, or?
No, we did not.
What was that year like for your parents?
I really don't have a good answer for that. All I know from later on is that they were very concerned and that they were making plans. My father made plans for us to get on it was a cruise ship leaving Barcelona to eventually end up in Cuba. I knew they were doing that, but at the time I really wasn't aware of it.
So your second attempt to leave, how did you travel? Can you take me by the hand and walk me through it?
Well, all I can really remember is that we took a train and we traveled through France. I think we stopped in Rouen, and then we ended up in the Pyrenees Mountains in a town called Pau, P-A-U. And from there, we ended up literally walking across into Spain and picking up a train there that took us to Barcelona.
When you left, and you can answer this for either the first attempt to leave or the second attempt, what could you take with you, the child?
We took very, very little with us. We did not even have large suitcases. My parents, I think, had some valuables that they were able to take with them, things like diamonds and things of that nature, but very little. We did not have a lot of luggage.
Would you say your family was fairly affluent
Yes.
before the war?
Yes, my parents were affluent.
Okay, so you came into Spain. How were you treated when you got there?
We were treated very nicely. We lived in a hotel. I think we were there maybe for 3-4 weeks. I remember sneaking off and going to a bullfight, which really thrilled me in those days because I was, again, a young boy, and I'd heard about those things but never witnessed one. And then we picked up a ship called the Marqués de Camillas, which was a cruise line, which basically took us around through Gibraltar into a place called Vigo, which was in Spain on the Atlantic side, and then into Cuba.
Before we leave Europe, do you have any other memories that you want to share about your time in Europe?
Not really, not any more than what I've already discussed here. I know it's very difficult because I was a young boy, and I was having a good time.
You were never afraid?
No. There was really, except at Dunkirk, there was a lot of shooting, but other than that, there was never any real reason because my parents sheltered us pretty well, from the harshness of being in occupied Antwerp during those days.
So you left Spain. Can you tell us about the ship? Who were some of the other passengers?
I really don't know too much about it, to tell you the truth. I was having the time of my life. I would go up to the bow of the ship and let the breeze flow over me. I do remember all that. I did not get seasick, and we had a great cruise into Havana.
You were not aware if other people were refugees also?
No,
You had.
no.
Can you give me a time frame when you left Spain, when you arrived in Cuba?
We left Spain approximately, it was sometime in the early summer of 1941.
Were your parents aware that Jewish refugees had been refused entry to Cuba in 1939 on the St. Louis?
I don't know that. I have no answer for that. Obviously, I became aware of it many, many years later, but
How were you treated in Cuba?
uh, it was very nice. Obviously, I knew no Spanish, so I had to learn very quickly. I went to school there. We also attended services on Saturdays. Unfortunately, my father ended up having a stroke while we were in Cuba, and that didn't make our stay there much easier, but we did manage.
Did you experience or witness any anti-Semitism in Cuba?
Not that I was aware of. I had no problems. Uh, as I said, we lived in a suburb of Havana called Vedado, and we really, as far as I know, had no anti-Semitic type situations at the time.
How did your family support itself when you were in Cuba?
My parents had brought some valuables out from Antwerp. I think they had diamonds which they were able to sell.
How long were you in Cuba? Can you give me?
We were in Cuba about 11 months. I remember very vividly Pearl Harbor Day. I had gone to the store to pick up some things for my parents, and everybody was talking about it. And by then, I knew enough Spanish to understand what they were saying. Although, again, I didn't understand the ramifications because I knew nothing about Pearl Harbor, but I did know that America was attacked.
Did the fact that America was now in the war have any impact on your entry to this country?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Did the fact that the U.S. now was at war after Pearl Harbor, did that have any impact on you trying to get into the United States?
I think it delayed us a bit because I do remember being ready to leave sometime in the early winter and then being told now we were going to stay a little bit longer. We ended up finally leaving sometime in May or June, I think it was, of 1942.
Was it always your parents' intention to go to the United States?
As far as I know, yes. Originally, it wasn't. Originally, they were going to go to England, but the situation in Dunkirk wiped all that out. And then my parents decided that the United States was really a better situation for us.
How did you leave Cuba and where did you go?
We flew into Miami. Uh, my parents, one of my parents had a distant relative who was a physician with the immigration service there, and he kind of smoothed things over for us.
Did any of the Jewish agencies help you come to the United States, or was it just privately done?
It was all privately done.
And you were not at all concerned about any quotas coming into the United
As far
States?
as I knew, no. But again, remember, I was a young boy, and
What else stands out in your mind about your time in Cuba before we start with the United States?
uh,
Any other memories you want to share?
no, a very minor thing. We lived next to a movie house, and every after they would have matinees every afternoon, and they would blare out a lot of music and songs, and that was my first exposure to the English language, which I imagine helped me later on when I had to learn English. Uh, I do remember that. I remember again going to synagogue with again it was with my mother because my father at the time was sick. Uh, but it was a relatively pleasant experience.
So now you're coming to the United States. What were your expectations of America?
Well, I was looking forward, you know, to learning English first of all, which fortunately my mother spoke English to begin with, so that made it a little bit easier because she taught my brother and me, a lot of the English that we ended up learning. She made it a lot easier for us, but because we ended up moving to New Jersey, which was where my mother had a distant cousin who actually made it a lot easier for us.
What were your first impressions of Americans and of the United States?
Uh, Modern, the word modern.
How were you treated by the American people?
I was uh, I was treated well. Of course, we had some difficulties uh, because I was a foreigner, and again, I was at the time about 11 years old, and on the street where we lived, some of the boys were a little more, shall we say, like bullies, but there was no permanent problem. We all got things straightened out pretty quickly. But there was the usual, I guess it's a normal type situation with boys our age. Uh, and of course, I didn't really speak any English yet, so that didn't make things too easy either.
When you came here, it sounds like you had some experience with anti-foreign
Yes.
sentiments, but
Yeah.
did you experience any anti-Semitism in
Uh,
this country?
Somewhat. Nothing is very serious, but so some people say there goes the Jew and stuff like that. Because we lived when we first moved to New Jersey, in a we lived in Camden, New Jersey, and we my mother's cousin had a rooming house in what I call the blue collar section, uh, where we lived for quite a while, and the people there weren't quite as friendly towards foreigners, you might say, but we had no serious problems, just small things.
What did people ask you And when I mean you and your family, not just you as the individual. But what did Americans ask you about your time in Europe or your time in Cuba? Were they curious about that?
Um, not not too much. No, no, there wasn't too much curiosity as far as I can remember. Uh, I still had an accent because I spoke a lot of French, and people called me Frenchie. That was my nickname. But there wasn't. There weren't too much. There weren't too much questions.
What adjustments were challenging for you or your family?
uh, Mostly language. Uh, Again, as I said, my mother spoke English, and she was pretty fluent in it. My brother and I had to learn it, so that was a real adjustment. And of course, to make friends and things like that in school. But it was all doable.
Brings me to my next question. How much education had you been able to get by the time you got to New Jersey? And then
Well,
I'll ask you about starting school in New Jersey.
I didn't really, we missed school. I had some in Cuba, uh, but then when we first came to New Jersey, I was enrolled in school. Uh, didn't speak English, but I still managed. Uh, I do. Uh, I do remember that in those days. I don't think that's the case now, but in those days, my teacher emphasized the fact that we should learn the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer before, at the beginning of every school day.
You didn't speak English and you hadn't had a lot of opportunity for education. Did they start you in school in the United States with your age group?
Yes, they did. Yes, and fortunately, at the school where they put us, we had a very understanding principal and some really good teachers.
Were you able to get any Jewish education?
Uh, it was funny. By the time my bar mitzvah year came, I had no knowledge of Hebrew or anything like that. But by then we had moved to a place which was next door to the synagogue, and we had a very understanding cantor there, and he taught me Hebrew, at least to read Hebrew. I never really understood to speak Hebrew, but I was able to read Hebrew, and I was also able to be bar mitzvah, because this was when I was in my 13th year.
Had your family maintained the level of religious observance that you had in Europe?
Not really, no. We did belong to a synagogue, which and we had originally been what you now call Orthodox. This synagogue was what we now call conservative, and we did belong there, but we weren't regular attendees, you might say, at services. Although, since we lived next door, and if things got tough and they didn't have a minyan, they would drag me over there because I was bar mitzvah at the time, and they needed the 10th person for a minyan. So, in that sense, we did participate more. And I was also I'm trying to think of the correct word. After the bar mitzvah. I was confirmed also.
While you were starting school in the United States and becoming a bar mitzvah, what was happening with your parents? How were they supporting themselves?
My father died within a few months after we came to the United States, and my mother went to work as a bookkeeper, and that's really. And of course, she did have some limited funds of her own, but that's pretty much how she supported us.
When did your father die and what happened to him?
He had that stroke in Cuba, and when we came over in '42, we came over. I think it was I said in sometime in the summer. He died in October, and he actually died of pneumonia. In those days, that was still a prevalent cause of death.
What did you and your family, your mother, know about what was going on to the Jews in Europe during the war years? How much did you know?
Well, we were aware of what was happening, and obviously there wasn't too much general knowledge about the concentration camp situation, but we did know, about the problem that the Jewish people had over in Europe, and we were well aware of all that.
Had your family tried to maintain contact with family and friends still in Europe?
Oh yes, unfortunately, most of my most of our family, which lived in who lived in Latvia and Estonia, they were all wiped out. My mother had twin brothers who were killed. My father had siblings who were killed. My mother had a sister who lived in Sweden, and of course, she didn't have the problem there.
How much did you, at home or in school, follow the progress of the war, the battles and whatnot?
Oh, we were well aware of everything that was going on continuously.
What stands out in your mind when you look back to the war years in the United States? What stands out in your memory?
During the war years, I became very much involved in a lot of activities, such as in those days you collected papers, you collected tin cans, you did a lot of that kind of stuff, and I was in the Boy Scouts, and we were involved in a lot of that kind of situations, until the end of the war, until '45.
Do you remember any deprivation in this country during the war years?
No, the only deprivation you might say was the fact that we had rationing, and there's certain foods that we didn't have, and my cousin, who was basically our mentor, he had a car that I forget, he had, I think, an A or B sticker, which meant that he could only get so many gallons of gasoline a month. Those kind of deprivation. Certainly nothing that would affect us in terms of our health or well-being or anything like that. It's just a normal wartime, unfortunately, wartime stuff.
You remember when Roosevelt died?
I sure do. Yeah, I remember that.
Can you share some of your memories on that?
Well, all I remembered that there was a guy by the name of Truman who took over, and nobody knew much about him. in those days, because you know originally Roosevelt's vice president was Wallace, and then he got dumped for Truman, and you know so we were well aware of all that kind of situation.
How would you describe the mood in the country when Roosevelt died? From your perspective as a,
Uh,
young person.
Basically, it was a big tragedy. Everybody was crying. They all thought that the greatest man on earth had died. It was a very very sad time of the. Unfortunately, in view of history, Roosevelt wasn't exactly the person that a lot of people thought he was, but that's politics, and I'm not getting into that. But in those days, everybody, everybody was in mourning.
You remember hearing about Hitler's death?
I remember hearing about it. Yeah, and we were well aware of VE Day and VJ days in those days. With a lot of celebration.
Okay. I'm going to pause for just a second and there's supposed to be a national alarm in 1 minute. So if there is an alarm and you hear any buzzing, we'll just wait. It's
Okay.
supposed to be 1 minute from now. And my phone is off. Everything's supposed to be off, but I don't know.
My phone's off too.
Yeah. I don't know what we're going to hear in a minute. Okay, I'm not hearing anything, so I think we can continue. I got an alert on my phone, but my phone is off. So let's continue. Where were you when you first heard that the war in Europe was over? And what do you remember of that moment?
This was in the late spring. My mother had sent me off to a farm in New Jersey to spend the summer. So I was with a whole bunch of friends, and of course I was only 14 years old in those days, but some of them had a car, and we went zooming around in the car, beeping the horn and celebrating. That's what I remember about VE Day.
When did you begin to realize what had happened to the Jews under the Nazis in Europe? When did that?
It all started, I would guess, around 1944, before the war was over, and then obviously after the war was over, when Eisenhower made his famous edict to take pictures of all these things that happened in the concentration camp. We were all well aware of all that.
How did that impact you, given your personal history?
We were very upset because even I remembered some of our relatives who had gotten killed.
What efforts did your mother make to try and find loved ones
Oh,
that were left behind?
she wrote letters. She went to agencies. Even after the war, she eventually ended up going back to Europe. And of course, that was all for naught as far as finding anybody. But they were all gone.
No survivors.
No. As a matter of fact, we ended up later on going to Israel and going to the memorial there where they had all the names of many of the people, and we found some in there.
Were you able to learn how they were deported or murdered?
No,
Did you?
no, we never got any details on any of that.
You mentioned Israel. What do you remember regarding the birth of the state of Israel? Did it have special meaning for you?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the end of your sentence.
I asked about the birth of the state of Israel. Do you remember the birth of the
Yes.
state of Israel, and did it have special meaning for you?
Oh yeah, I remember listening to the radio when the I guess it was the United Nations basically stated that Israel was a nation, and we had big celebrations about that. I remember that vividly.
Is there anything more you wanted to say about it?
No, as I said, we ended up going there. I've been there a couple of times, and I've always felt that it was one place you could go as a Jew.
What did you think you would be when you grew up? As you were going through traveling and moving around and then, spending the war years here, what did you think you would be as an adult?
And this is one of these things that maybe it's my stubborn nature, but ever since I was in my early teens, I wanted to be an engineer. And that's what I ended up being.
Can you tell me about your education?
Well, I ended up going to university, gaining a bachelor's. Then I also got a master's in engineering, and then I also got another master's in engineering management. So I was, I guess, a self-styled scholar for quite a while.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school at Drexel University, the University of Pennsylvania, the George Washington University, and also took courses at the University of Alabama. So it was quite a trip.
Did you ever serve in the American military?
Yes, I was in the Army.
When was this?
I was in the Army from 1957 on.
For how long?
Well, I was actually in the active service only for a year, but I was in the reserves for 6 years.
And what were your duties and responsibilities when you served?
I was basically I already had my engineering degree, so I just did electronic stuff in the Army. I did not any specific thing, but I had an interesting anecdote. For some reason, after basic training, my records got confused, and so they gave you tests and stuff. And so apparently I did really well in the test. And the colonel called me in and said, with your aptitude, you should try to get a high school diploma. And I said, what? He says, yeah, well, it says here that you never even finished high school. I told him, well, I have a master's degree. And it turned out that the records had gotten confused.
What was your final rank?
My final rank was private. I was glad to get out. Military was not for me.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Did you experience any anti-Semitism either in your advanced studies or in the military?
In the military, I did experience anti-Semitism, which I got straightened out very quickly.
Can you tell us about it, please?
No, it was this one person, and I literally threatened him, and he backed off. but but I have experienced what you might call not exactly anti-Semitism, but at one time at work, my very superior manager made a comment about, oh, we have to Jew him down a little bit. And of course, I let him know what I thought about that.
I assume you're an American citizen.
I sure am.
When did you become an American citizen? And what is it like
God.
for you to be an American?
It was, I think in those days you had to wait 5 years. And I was still in high school. So it was approximately in 1947, 48, something like that.
What is it like for you to be an American citizen?
I'm very proud. Even in today's situations, I'm still proud to be an American.
Can you tell us a little bit about your career?
Well, I was electrical engineering. I was involved in doing a lot of research work. I was involved in radar. I was involved in airships, also underground communications, a whole raft of things that I was involved in, but mostly design and research activities.
Did you marry and have a family?
I was married and had a daughter. Unfortunately, my wife passed away very young. She was only 36 years old, and 5 years later, I remarried, and we've been married 44 years.
What did you tell your family about your wartime experiences and about the family that was lost in the war?
Well, I pretty much told them everything. Of course, they were always very curious to begin with, and I never held anything back. I basically told them everything that happened. And when when the movie Dunkirk came out a couple of years ago, there was, of course, a lot of discussion about that because I had told them about my experiences there.
Can you share some of what you talked about with regard to the movie?
There wasn't really much to talk about. The movie was very realistic. It was really pretty much exactly what I witnessed. So there isn't much else to be said there.
Do you speak publicly or have you spoken publicly about your experiences?
I think, if I remember correctly, when I was in high school, there was a public speaking competition, which I entered, and I seem to remember that I spoke about that in those. But other than that, there was never any real occasion for me to do that.
I realize you were young during the Nuremberg trials. Did you follow the trial at all?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Yeah, I was watching it all the time.
What do you remember about that?
Well, I remembered, that some of the defendants got off pretty easily. Uh, that many of them got what they deserved. It was all a very interesting type situation. But
What about the Eichmann trial? Did you follow that?
I did in those days. I don't remember too much about it, to tell you the truth. But I did follow it, including the glass cage in which he had to sit.
Did you feel justice was done in Nuremberg or in the Eichmann trial?
In what? Justice was done where?
In Nuremberg or in Jerusalem with the Eichmann trial? Did you feel justice
Yeah,
was done?
yeah, I thought it was. They really, they couldn't have done too much more than what they did. Unfortunately, a lot of them got away, and they're still being found in places like Argentina. But it's it's difficult, I can't remember his name, the gentleman who kept following them and trying to. He passed away fairly recently. I can't remember his name.
When you see the situation in Ukraine with the refugees, what's your gut reaction?
Oh boy, you're getting into a situation here where I just can't forget what happened in Ukraine during the war. It's just there. It's unfortunate. The same way I feel, or I used to feel even more about Germans. You know, I feel bad for the Ukrainians, but I remember what they were like when the way they treated the Jews. So I have really mixed emotions there.
What about when you see refugees on America's border with Mexico?
Again, I feel sorry for them, but I feel that we have to uphold the laws. And the laws are there, and they're just not upholding them. And of course, I was one of them. I was a refugee, and I can certainly feel for them. But what's happening now, this chaos. I mean, I know we're getting into politics, which I really want to avoid. But
You don't have to get into that. I don't have to make you feel uncomfortable and ask about politics. But is there anything we haven't discussed that you would like to add before I ask you my last question?
no,
Anything we haven't covered?
I think I pretty much feel you've covered everything, more than everything.
Okay, so I will ask you my last question, sir. What message do you have for future viewers who will watch this interview in 100 years? What's your takeaway message?
Well, I guess my message is, when all this happened, I was a young boy. Then later on, as I grew into my teenage years, I understood a lot more about what was there. And now in my oldest years, I kind of feel a little bit distant. But the one thing I guess I would recommend is flexibility. You, you have to be flexible with all the things that happened. When I was young, I guess I was pretty flexible, and I was able to adapt to all the different situations. And that's really my one word message is flexibility.
I thank you for speaking with us today. And this will conclude the interview.
Thank you.